Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. The toll booth's existence didn't make sense on paper. A lone wooden shack nestled on a shadowy road no GPS would suggest, still bearing a chipped sign from the 1950s. 25 cents, it read, as though time had frozen. The town surrounding this desolate outpost wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of the country, it seemed immune to the decay plaguing similar rural towns. Roads were pristine, schools well-funded, and jobs plentiful. This wasn't luck. It was something else. The booth was no ordinary toll checkpoint. Those who operated it, a highly selective group, were paid handsomely and sworn to secrecy. Every attendant knew the rules that kept the town safe and the road beyond the gate in check. I'd worked the night shift for years, taking pride in my part of maintaining this delicate balance. An hour before sunset, I'd be dropped off by the sheriff or one of his deputies, always alone. No phones, radios, or electronic devices were permitted. Only a flashlight and the dim ceiling bulb inside the booth offered reprieve from the suffocating darkness. At first, I believed the rules were eccentric relics of small-town paranoia. That was before my first shift, before I realized the horrors this booth existed to guard against. The rules of the toll booth. The rules were simple, their consequences not. Never abandon your post during the night. No matter the sound of footsteps in the woods, the strange voices, or the occasional thudding of something large against the barrier arm, you stay put. No modern technology allowed. If a device accidentally turns on, destroy it immediately. The sounds it might emit, piercing screams or distorted whispers, are not your own. Evaluate every driver carefully. Confused or distressed travelers might stumble onto the road. Their destination depended on their toll. Ordinary coins meant they turned back. Black coins meant they drove into a place beyond mortal understanding. But Rule 4, the one we dreaded most, concerned the hunter. When the hunter arrives, lift the arm. Do not interfere, no matter what he drags behind him. The hunter's arrival was unforgettable. The distant sound of hooves echoed down the road one moonless night, growing louder until the towering figure of a bull moose emerged from the black. Its coat was darker than the void surrounding it, except for its brilliant white antlers and glowing eyes. Upon the moose's back sat the hunter, a shadowy silhouette with those same glowing eyes, holding reins that looked like woven starlight. Dragging behind them, tethered by a thick rope, was something grotesque. The first time, I barely held my nerve. My flashlight revealed a creature like nothing found in nature. Its torso was humanoid, but its face, a twisted fusion of beast and man, snarled with unearthly malice. As the moose and hunter crossed through the gate, their prisoner thrashed violently against the bindings. I raised the barrier, trembling. My training said to stay still, but I hid behind the booth, peeking out as the monster was dragged away into the endless dark of the road. The next morning, I was told that whatever the hunter captured wasn't meant to be here. Our job wasn't just to collect tolls. It was to ensure nothing from the other side stayed too long. Most nights passed quietly, an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional black coin handed over by a passing spirit. They were already dead, paying their way into whatever lay beyond the bend in the road. One such spirit haunted my thoughts. A man, disheveled and panicked, arrived at the gate late one night. He begged me to explain where he was, why the road felt familiar yet alien. When I asked for the toll, his face went blank. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands, pulling out the black coin. With a single, resigned nod, he drove forward, disappearing into the shadows. The next morning, I saw his face on the news. He'd been reported dead in a car accident hours earlier. My booth wasn't a toll road for the living. It was a gateway to somewhere else. But not everyone who approached the booth followed the rules of death. One night, years before I began working, a traveler ignored the booth attendant's warning. Frustrated and enraged, he shoved the operator aside, raised the arm himself, and drove through. What happened next became local legend. The following night, the man returned. This time he was confused, amnesiac, and clutching a black coin. Despite his protests, the attendant allowed him to pass through. He returned again the next night, and the next. For decades, the man's car has rolled up to the booth every evening like clockwork, his fate sealed in an endless loop of death without passage. It was a cautionary tale for attendants, a reminder of what could happen if the rules were broken. The town's former toll attendants met weekly to share their knowledge. Most of these gatherings were uneventful, until I called for an emergency meeting after a particular shift. The hunter had arrived as usual, dragging a horrifying new prisoner. This time, it wasn't just some malformed creature or monstrosity. It was something far worse, a thing that seemed to recognize me. Its body was a horrifying fusion of human and beast, limbs twisted and blackened as though burned. Cloven hooves dragged deep grooves into the asphalt. The face was a mockery of humanity, distorted by antlers and a haunting grin that stretched too far. As the hunter's moose crossed the gate, I felt the creature's eyes lock onto mine. Its gaze was filled with malicious intent, and though its mouth didn't move, I heard a voice, cold and seething. "You cannot stop it," it whispered. I barely slept that morning. At the meeting, I recounted the events, and the room fell silent. One of the elders, a former toll keeper, cleared his throat and uttered words that sent chills through my bones. "It's not supposed to recognize you," he said gravely. "And if it does, it means the rules are changing." The town's silence felt different that morning. Normally, the toll booth and its rules were secrets shared only among the select few who worked the gate, but the thing I'd seen had stirred something deeper, a fear that clung to my skin even in daylight. The elder's words replayed in my mind like a broken record. If it recognizes you, the rules are changing. What did that mean? How could a creature from beyond our understanding single me out? I felt like I had stumbled onto a truth I was never meant to see. The next evening, Sheriff Harlow drove me back to the booth as usual, though the tension in his grip on the steering wheel was palpable. "Something bothering you?" I asked, breaking the heavy silence. He hesitated, then sighed. "I've been at this job a long time, son. Dropping attendance off at that booth. You're the first one who's ever called for an emergency meeting. Whatever you saw..." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Just remember, the rules are there for a reason." As he pulled to a stop, he handed me a worn, leather-bound notebook. "Take this. It belonged to the guy before you. Might help." I barely had time to thank him before he drove off, leaving me alone with the booth, the encroaching dark, and a storm of questions. Inside the booth, I flipped on the dim ceiling bulb and examined the notebook. Its pages were filled with hastily scribbled notes, diagrams, and chilling sketches. One stood out immediately, a rough drawing of the hunter on his moose, dragging some nightmarish creature. Beneath it, the previous attendant had scrawled, "The hunter isn't just a guardian, he's a collector. But what does he do with the ones he collects?" Other entries detailed strange occurrences at the booth, shadowy figures circling the woods, travelers speaking in riddles, even accounts of attendants disappearing without a trace. One phrase appeared repeatedly. "The rules keep us safe, but they are not infallible." I was halfway through the notebook when the first car of the night arrived. A beat-up sedan pulled up to the gate, its headlights cutting through the thickening fog. The driver, a middle-aged man with bloodshot eyes, fumbled for change as I slid the window open. "Rough night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He didn't respond immediately, his hands trembling as he dropped a few quarters into the tray. But then he looked at me, his expression hollow. "Do you ever feel like something's watching you?" he asked. Before I could answer, he shook his head and muttered, "Never mind," before driving off into the mist. I watched his taillights disappear down the road, unease prickling the back of my neck. Something about his question lingered, an echo of the same dread I felt when the creature had locked eyes with me. The fog grew thicker as the night deepened, swallowing the moonlight and turning the woods into an impenetrable wall of shadows. I was rereading the notebook when I heard it. the faint rhythmic clop of hooves on asphalt. My heart sank. The hunter was here again. I grabbed the flashlight, stepping out of the booth as the towering silhouette emerged from the mist. The moose's antlers glowed like ghostly beacons, and its glowing eyes cut through the darkness with unnerving clarity. Behind it, the creature it dragged was obscured by the fog, though its shape seemed wrong, its limbs bending in unnatural angles, its movements erratic and spasmodic. The hunter's head turned slightly as if acknowledging me, though he said nothing. I raised the barrier arm with shaking hands, my eyes fixed on the grotesque figure trailing behind him. As they passed, the creature let out a guttural, bone-chilling screech. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a vibration in my chest that made my breath hitch. For a brief moment, the fog parted, revealing its face. It was my face. My own twisted features stared back at me, warped into a mask of agony and malice. The creature's lips moved, but instead of words, I heard a cacophony of distorted whispers, overlapping and unintelligible. The hunter yanked the rope, and the thing was dragged into the darkness. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the booth floor, gasping for air. The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror and paranoia. Every rustle in the woods felt like a threat, every shadow a potential horror. I was ready to call it quits. Rules be damned when I saw movement at the edge of the tree line. A figure emerged, stumbling onto the road. It was a woman, her clothes torn and muddy, her face pale and drawn. She looked alive, but something about her was off. Her movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, as though she were being guided by unseen strings. She stopped in front of the booth, her glassy eyes locking onto mine. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me." I reached for the window but hesitated. The rules were clear. Never leave the booth at night. "What happened to you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They took me," she said, her voice breaking. "But I escaped. Please, let me in. They'll come back for me." My hand hovered over the latch. Every instinct screamed at me to help her, but the notebook's warnings rang in my ears. The rules keep us safe. "What's your name?" I asked instead, stalling. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her movements unnatural. That's when I saw it. Her shadow. It didn't match her shape. While she appeared human, the shadow cast by the booth's light was something else entirely. It was hunched and monstrous, its limbs elongating unnaturally as it stretched toward the booth. "Let me in," she repeated, her voice taking on a distorted, guttural tone. I slammed the window shut and locked it, backing away as the shadow clawed at the glass. Her expression twisted into something inhuman, her eyes glowing faintly as she hissed, "You can't hide forever." The ceiling bulb flickered, plunging the booth into momentary darkness. When the light returned, she was gone. Only her footprints remained, leading back into the fog. When the sheriff arrived at dawn, I didn't wait for his questions. I handed him the notebook and recounted everything. The hunter, the creature with my face, the woman with the monstrous shadow. He listened silently, his face grim. When I finished, he leaned against the booth, staring at the horizon. "You need to talk to the elder," he said finally. "If the rules are changing, we're in trouble." As he drove me back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that my time at the booth was unraveling something far bigger than I'd imagined. The elder's words echoed in my mind. The rules keep us safe, but they are not infallible. The elder's cabin was a small, weathered structure nestled at the edge of the town's wooded expanse. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, mixing with the early morning fog. Sheriff Harlow didn't follow me inside. He simply dropped me off at the door with a warning glance. "Listen carefully. What you're about to hear might change everything." I knocked 3 times. The door creaked open just enough for me to glimpse the elder's piercing eyes, eyes that seemed to see far more than the ordinary world allowed. He didn't speak, only gestured for me to enter. The inside of the cabin was dim and filled with the scent of herbs and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with bottles, scrolls, and old books. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. "I know why you're here," the elder said, his voice low and steady. He motioned for me to sit at the table. "You've seen something. You're not meant to. I didn't hesitate. I saw the creature, the one with my face, and the hunter. I trailed off, unsure of what I was even asking. He sighed, sitting across from me. This road, this booth, it's all part of something much older than you or me. The tolls are not just for passage through life and death. They're for keeping something worse at bay. His words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. What's out there? I asked. The elder's gaze flickered to the fire, as if contemplating how much to reveal. The hunter is not a protector. He is the balance. He keeps the breach closed. The breach? Yes. He nodded slowly. The boundary between worlds. The gate. When the breach opens, things from beyond our reality slip through. The rules keep that from happening, but they are weakening. I couldn't keep up with the complexity of what he was saying. The creature I saw, it knew me. The rules said it wasn't supposed to recognize me. What does that mean? It means the breach is widening, the elder replied gravely. When the rules begin to fail, it's a sign that the boundary is collapsing. The weight of his words crushed me. If the breach truly was widening, if the rules were unraveling, there was no telling what could come through next. I leaned forward, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. What happens if the breach fully opens? The elder didn't answer immediately. He simply stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. Things you don't want to meet, things that feast on fear, on chaos, things that will undo everything. Your job as an attendant is more than just collecting tolls. You're part of a much larger system, and now that system is breaking down. We spent hours talking. The elder shared what little he knew of the history of the toll road and the hunter. The road had been built in the early 1900s as a barrier between two realms, but only a few knew the true purpose of the toll booth. Over time, its function had been obscured by time, superstition, and the town's isolated nature. As the conversation wore on, the elder's urgency grew. He handed me an ancient worn map and pointed to a small marking deep in the forest. This is where the breach lies. It's been dormant for decades, but it's waking up now. If you want to stop this, you need to go to the source. I stared at the map, my heart racing. What am I supposed to do when I get there? Close it, the elder said simply. There's a ritual, a way to seal the breach for good, but it's not without consequences. What kind of consequences? I asked, my voice tight with fear. You may not come back, the elder said quietly. But if you don't try, this town, and everything you've ever known, will be consumed. I left the elder's cabin feeling heavier than I ever had before. Sheriff Harlow was waiting outside. His eyes narrowed as I approached. You know what you have to do, don't you? I nodded grimly. I do. Without another word, he drove me to the edge of town and stopped by the old forest road. The fog was thicker now, the trees looming like dark sentinels watching over the path ahead. Sheriff Harlow handed me a small leather pouch. This contains the key, he said. When you reach the breach, you'll know what to do. I didn't ask what was inside. The less I knew, the better. The town had always been a place of rules, but now the rules felt more like a prison than protection. Be careful, Sheriff Harlow said, his voice unusually soft. The road you're about to walk is one that leads to places where no one's supposed to go. With that, he turned and drove off, leaving me to face the forest alone. I stood at the threshold of the woods, a chill settling in my bones. The further I walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The air was thick with fog, and the world grew muffled, as if sound itself was afraid to exist here. Every step felt heavier, as though the earth itself was resisting my progress. The path was wind. The stone arch loomed ahead, its surface covered in dark, creeping moss. It looked like an ancient ruin from a forgotten age, yet there was something undeniably alive about it, pulsing with a subtle energy that seemed to hum in the air. I stepped closer, the ground beneath me squelching with every footfall as the fog thickened. It was like walking through a dream, Or perhaps a nightmare. I held the vial tightly, its soft blue glow the only source of light in this oppressive darkness. The elder's words echoed in my mind. When you reach the breach, you'll know what to do. But what did that mean? How could I possibly know how to seal a rift between worlds, a place that shouldn't even exist? The clearing around the arch seemed to shimmer, the trees bending unnaturally as if drawn toward the gate. It was wrong. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to leave this cursed place behind. But I had no choice. The rules were breaking. The creatures were already coming through. I moved closer, and the air grew thick, stifling, almost suffocating. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my skin prickled with an unnatural cold. It was as though the very fabric of reality was warping, stretching thin around this portal. I was standing on the threshold of something ancient, something I shouldn't be able to comprehend. I could hear whispers in the distance, low, guttural voices, like distant chants from an old, forgotten language. The hairs on my neck stood up, and my heart raced. I wasn't alone. I looked around but saw no one, only shadows in the fog, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Then, from behind me, I heard it. The sound of hooves. I froze. The hunter. I turned quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. He was there, riding that same black moose with its glowing eyes, the light from its antlers piercing the fog. But tonight there was something different in his gaze, something darker. His eyes locked onto mine. I felt an icy chill wash over me. It was as though he was aware of my every thought, my every fear. I stepped back, instinctively clutching the vial tighter. The hunter spoke, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here," he warned, his words like a deep, rumbling growl. "The breach was never meant to be closed by one of you." I swallowed hard, unable to speak. I wasn't prepared for this. No one had warned me that the hunter himself would try to stop me. But then again, he wasn't the one protecting the gate. He was the balance. I reached for the vial again, feeling the warmth of it in my hand. The moment I touched it, the whispers around me grew louder, more frantic. The fog seemed to swirl in on itself, pulling away from the arch as though it was afraid of what was about to happen. I glanced at the hunter, but his eyes never left mine. He was waiting, watching, his moose's hooves scraping against the dirt as if ready to charge. I knew what I had to do. Without another word, I stepped forward, my feet crunching the brittle leaves beneath me. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent pushing against the boundary. It was as though the earth itself was trying to expel me from the ritual, from the very act of defying the breach. I stood before the stone arch, holding the vial in front of me. I had no idea what would happen when I opened it, but the time had come to make my choice, to either seal this rift or risk unleashing something far worse. Taking a deep breath, I uncorked the vial. The moment the stopper came off, the ground trembled. The air crackled with energy, and I felt something sharp and powerful tear through the veil between the worlds. The fog parted, revealing the arch in its full form, glowing with an unearthly light that seemed to burn the very edges of reality. The hunter reared his moose back, a look of sudden understanding in his eyes. He knew what I was doing now, but it was too late. I poured the contents of the vial onto the ground. The liquid pooled at my feet, shimmering in the light from the arch. There was a pulse, a wave of energy that radiated outward, and suddenly, the air was filled with a deafening roar, as if something was trying to break through. The ground cracked, and the stone arch shuddered violently. I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I watched the breach begin to close. The portal flickered and pulsed, the fabric of reality stretching and snapping like a thin wire. The air grew unbearably hot, the temperature rising until it felt like my skin was burning. Then, with a final thunderous crack, the breach snapped shut. The world fell silent. The fog cleared. The oppressive weight lifted from my chest. The stone arch loomed ahead, its surface covered in dark, creeping moss. It looked like an ancient ruin from a forgotten age, yet there was something undeniably alive about it, pulsing with a subtle energy that seemed to hum in the air. I stepped closer, the ground beneath me squelching with every footfall as the fog thickened. It was like walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. I held the vial tightly, its soft blue glow the only source of light in this oppressive darkness. The elder's words echoed in my mind. When you reach the breach, you'll know what to do. But what did that mean? How could I possibly know how to seal a rift between worlds, a place that shouldn't even exist? The clearing around the arch seemed to shimmer, the trees bending unnaturally as if drawn toward the gate. It was wrong. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to leave this cursed place behind. But I had no choice. The rules were breaking. The creatures were already coming through. I moved closer and the air grew thick, stifling, almost suffocating. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my skin prickled with an unnatural cold. It was as though the very fabric of reality was warping, stretching thin around this portal. I was standing on the threshold of something ancient, something I shouldn't be able to comprehend. I could hear whispers in the distance, low, guttural voices like distant chants from an old, forgotten language. The hairs on my neck stood up, and my heart raced. I wasn't alone. I looked around but saw no one. Only shadows in the fog, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Then, from behind me, I heard it, the sound of hooves. I froze. The hunter. I turned quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. He was there, riding that same black moose with its glowing eyes, the light from its antlers piercing the fog. But tonight, there was something different in his gaze. Something darker. His eyes locked onto mine. I felt an icy chill wash over me. It was as though he was aware of my every thought, my every fear. I stepped back, instinctively clutching the vial tighter. The hunter spoke, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here," he warned, his words like a deep, rumbling growl. "The breach was never meant to be closed by one of you." I swallowed hard, unable to speak. I wasn't prepared for this. No one had warned me that the hunter himself would try to stop me. But then again, he wasn't the one protecting the gate. He was the balance. I reached for the vial again, feeling the warmth of it in my hand. The moment I touched it, the whispers around me grew louder, more frantic. The fog seemed to swirl in on itself, pulling away from the arch as though it was afraid of what was about to happen. I glanced at the hunter, but his eyes never left mine. He was waiting, watching, his moose's hooves scraping against the dirt as if ready to charge. I knew what I had to do. Without another word, I stepped forward, my feet crunching the brittle leaves beneath me. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent pushing against the boundary. It was as though the earth itself was trying to expel me from the ritual, from the very act of defying the breach. I stood before the stone arch, holding the vial in front of me. I had no idea what would happen when I opened it, but the time had come to make my choice, to either seal this rift or risk unleashing something far worse. Taking a deep breath, I uncorked the vial. The moment the stopper came off, the ground trembled. The air crackled with energy, and I felt something sharp and powerful tear through the veil between the worlds. The fog parted, revealing the arch in its full form, glowing with an unearthly light that seemed to burn the very edges of reality. The hunter reared his moose back, a look of sudden understanding in his eyes. He knew what I was doing now, but it was too late. I poured the contents of the vial onto the ground. The liquid pooled at my feet, shimmering in the light from the arch. There was a pulse, a wave of energy that radiated outward, and suddenly the air was filled with a deafening roar, as if something was trying to break through. The ground cracked, and the stone arch shuddered violently. I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I watched the breach begin to close. The portal flickered and pulsed, the fabric of reality stretching and snapping like a thin wire. The air grew unbearably hot, the temperature rising until it felt like my skin was burning. Then, with a final thunderous crack, the breach snapped shut. The world fell silent. The fog cleared, The oppressive weight lifted from my chest. I could barely stand. My legs were weak, my heart thundering in my chest. My mind spun as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. The hunter stood still, his eyes narrowing, a mix of anger and something else. Something almost like resignation. "You've done it," he muttered, almost to himself. I didn't know if I had succeeded, or if I had simply delayed the inevitable. All I knew was that the breach was sealed for now. The hunter's gaze softened just slightly. "You've bought us time," he said quietly, "but time is running out." Before I could respond, he spurred his moose and rode off into the night, disappearing into the fog. The forest around me seemed to exhale, the oppressive silence that followed almost more unnerving than the chaos I'd just witnessed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The vial was empty now, the last remnants of the strange liquid having seeped into the earth beneath my feet. But what did this mean? Was it over? Or had I merely delayed the reckoning? The world around me was still. The breach had closed. But at what cost? As I turned to leave the clearing, a thought gnawed at the back of my mind. I had sealed the breach, but there was something the hunter had said that I couldn't ignore. Time is running out. The journey back to the toll booth was like a dream, or more accurately, like a nightmare that couldn't be fully remembered. The woods were unnaturally silent, as if even the trees were holding their breath. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on me. It was as though the very air had changed, thickened, and no longer welcomed me. I didn't know what I had sealed. All I knew was that something terrible, had been stopped from crossing, if only for a time. But in the back of my mind, a seed of doubt had been planted. The hunter's words had cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Time is running out. As I neared the toll booth, a wave of unease swept over me. The road ahead looked different, darker somehow, as if the world beyond the gate had shifted in response to the ritual. The wooden shack stood silent in the distance, the faint flicker of the booth's dim light barely visible through the encroaching fog. It was as if the booth was waiting for something or someone. When I reached the booth, I half expected to find it abandoned. Perhaps the toll had served its purpose. Maybe the rules had been rewritten, the balance had been restored, and the hunter would never return. But as I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Old, stale, like something had rotted in the air. The booth was empty. No sheriff, no deputy, no one waiting to relieve me. Just silence. And on the desk, in the center of the room, was something that made my blood run cold. A single black coin. It hadn't been there before. I felt my stomach drop. The black coin wasn't just a symbol of death. It was the marker of a passage to something far worse. And it was sitting on the desk, waiting for me. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the coin cold and heavy in my palm. For a moment I wondered if it was a sign that I had failed, that something had slipped through the breach. But no. The vial was empty. The portal had been sealed. Or had it? A voice echoed in the back of my mind. "You sealed the breach, but you didn't seal the road." I looked up, searching the booth's dusty interior for any signs of movement. Was I imagining things? The shadows seemed to shift at the edges of the room, pulling away from the light as if they were aware of my growing fear. Then, the gate. The toll booth's barrier arm. It was moving. I rushed to the window and stared out into the darkness. The road beyond the gate was alive again, the faintest glow flickering at the horizon, like headlights coming down the road. And they weren't alone. I could see shadows moving, creatures on the edge of the light, lurking just out of view. It was like the forest itself had come alive, as though it were made up of living nightmares that were creeping toward me. The black coin in my hand burned with an intense heat, like a brand searing into my palm. And then I heard it, a slow, rhythmic thudding against the pavement, the unmistakable sound of hooves. I had no time to think. Panic rose in my chest like a tidal wave. The hunter was coming back. Or worse, something worse than the hunter, something far more sinister. I scrambled for the toll arm, my hands shaking as I lifted it. The creatures were close now, their presence pressing in from all sides. I didn't know what would happen if I failed to raise the arm in time, but I could already feel the road beginning to shift. The rules were already beginning to bend again. The thudding of hooves grew louder. The creatures were too close, too many. There was no escaping them. I forced the arm all the way up, my heart in my throat, and just as I thought it would be too late, the figures came into view. It wasn't the hunter this time. No, this was something worse. A pack of them. Shadowed figures riding twisted, warped beasts, cloaked in darkness. Their eyes were pools of black voids, and they looked directly at me, as though they were waiting for permission to cross. I froze, unable to breathe, unable to move. The first rider was different than the others. He had a face, twisted and distorted, with deep gashes and a twisted grin stretched unnaturally wide across his face. His eyes were cold, empty pits of darkness, and his grin seemed to grow as he saw me. "Do you remember me?" the rider called out in a voice that cracked the air like thunder. I couldn't respond. My throat closed, the sound of my pulse ringing in my ears. The riders closed in, their creatures snapping at the air, their eyes locked onto me. They were close now, so close, and I realized something then. The hunter had been the first warning. This was the reckoning. The rider's smile twisted deeper, impossibly wide, as he raised his hand and pointed directly at me. "You were never meant to stop it," he whispered, the words sent like daggers through my heart. "You sealed nothing, only delayed the inevitable." The riders began to move forward. Slowly, unnaturally. Their beasts dragged their hooves, and with every step, the very ground seemed to shake with the weight of their presence. I stepped back, realizing in that moment that the toll booth's rules had never been about stopping them. It had been about keeping them at bay. But they were already here. I could hear the hooves coming closer, the rhythmic pounding echoing off the pavement as the figures drew near. Their twisted beasts were like nightmares brought to life, their hollow eyes glowing with the promise of some unholy fate. I had no choice but to watch as they approached, their shadows swallowing the last remnants of light. The rider with the grotesque smile led the pack. His face, a hideous distortion, was frozen in that same smile as he neared the toll booth. The darkness around him seemed to follow, an oily presence that clung to the air like smoke. I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating, like the world was bending to their will. "You should have known," the rider crooned, his voice like nails scraping down a chalkboard. "You thought you could break the rules, but the rules were never meant for you." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. My body was frozen in place, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I clutched the toll booth's barrier arm. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was stand there as they drew closer. The black coin in my hand burned with a searing heat, as though it were alive, its power radiating through my skin. The rider's grin stretched impossibly wide, and I realized then that it wasn't just a smile. It was a mouth. A dark, gaping abyss that seemed to stretch on forever, filled with gnashing teeth and writhing tendrils. It was the embodiment of hunger, of something ancient and unstoppable. "You've disturbed the balance," the rider said, his voice dripping with malice. "And now you will pay the price." I didn't understand what he meant. I had followed the rules. I had done everything I was told, but I hadn't sealed anything. The breach was still open, and I had done nothing but delay the inevitable. The other riders had reached the booth now. Their creatures snarled and snapped at the air, their eyes locked on me with an unblinking, predatory gaze. The ground beneath me seemed to quake with their presence, the toll booth groaning under the weight of their darkness. "I don't know what you want," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I've done everything." "Everything?" the rider interrupted with a laugh, dark and hollow. "You think you've done everything? No, you've merely postponed the end. And now it's time to finish what you've started." He reached down from his mount, his fingers long and skeletal, and plucked the black coin from my hand with unsettling gentleness. The moment his fingers touched it, the coin let out a low, ominous hum, vibrating with a power that sent shockwaves through my entire body. "You were never meant to keep them out," the writer continued. "You were meant to usher them through." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My head spun as the realization washed over me. I wasn't meant to be the gatekeeper. I wasn't meant to keep them away. I was meant to bring them in, to let them pass. I had been a part of something much bigger than I had ever imagined. The toll booth, the rules, it was all a lie. A lie to keep me in the dark, to keep me complicit in this never-ending cycle. The riders dismounted one by one, their forms shifting as they did. They weren't human, not fully. The darkness that clung to them was too much, too overpowering. They were entities from beyond the veil, creatures from a realm that existed just out of reach of the living. "You've been a good little gatekeeper," the rider with the twisted grin said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But now your time is up." I could feel the toll booth shaking beneath me, the air growing thicker, heavier. The world around me seemed to distort, as though reality itself was being bent out of shape. And then, the sound of something cracking, a thunderous roar that split the air like a lightning strike. The barrier arm I had so carefully raised, the one I had fought to protect, shattered. The toll booth cracked down the middle, splitting in half as the darkness seeped through the cracks. The riders moved forward, their eyes burning with hunger, and I knew then that I was powerless to stop them. This was their domain, not mine. I had only been a pawn in a game that spanned centuries. "You've done your part," the rider said, his voice a cold whisper in the back of my mind. "But now, it's time to join us." The ground beneath me buckled, and before I could react, I felt myself being pulled into the darkness. The riders' forms dissolved into the shadows, their grotesque faces melting into the night as they passed through the gate. The last thing I saw was the toll booth, its lights flickering one final time before being consumed by the darkness. And in that brief moment of light, I saw a figure standing at the entrance. It wasn't a rider. It wasn't a creature from the shadows. It was a man, familiar, but not. It was me. And then, there was nothing. The toll booth still stands, or so the rumors say. People still drive through the night unaware of the horrors lurking just beyond the bend. And as for me, I'm still here somewhere, watching, waiting, because the rules, they never stop, and neither do we.